The moment you stop chasing, everything changes. If blocking them were truly the answer, then why are you still thinking about them? Why are you still replaying conversations in your head? Why are you still wondering whether they miss you? Why are you still secretly hoping they finally understand what they lost? Because deep down, you already know something most people refuse to admit. Silent is not power, not by itself. Real power is emotional detachment, and there is a difference. Right now, they still think they understand you. They think they know exactly how you'll react. They think if they message you tomorrow, you'll answer. Maybe not immediately, maybe after a few hours, maybe after pretending to hesitate, but eventually, you'll still be there. And that certainty is exactly why they are not afraid of losing you. Because people rarely value what feels guaranteed. Think about that for a second. Nobody obsesses over oxygen. Nobody wakes up grateful for gravity. Nobody spends their days terrified of losing what they assume will always exist. And for too long, that's what you became. Predictable, emotionally available, always reachable. You thought loyalty would make them value you. You thought consistency would make them appreciate you. You thought explaining yourself would finally make them understand. But human psychology does not work that way. People do not panic when they have certainty. They panic when certainty disappears. And that is where everything changes. Because the moment you stop reacting the way they expected, you stop being predictable. And the human mind becomes obsessed with what it cannot predict. That's why unfinished endings haunt people. That's why unanswered questions stay in the mind for years. That's why silence can feel louder than screaming. Imagine watching a movie that completely pulls you in. The music is building. The emotions are rising. Everything is leading toward the final moment. And then suddenly, the screen cuts to black. No ending, no explanation, no resolution. Just silence. Your brain refuses to let it go. Not because the movie was loud, but because it never finished. That is what unpredictability does to the human mind. And for the first time, that is what you are becoming. Not angry, not emotional, not reactive, unreadable. Let's be honest. For a long time, you made things too easy. You answered too quickly. You forgave too easily. You stayed too available. Every time they pulled away, you moved closer. Every time they gave less, you gave more. And slowly, without realizing it, you trained them to believe they would never truly lose you. That is the tragedy of overgiving. The more constant you become, the less emotionally expensive your presence feels. Imagine walking into a casino and finding a slot machine that pays out every single time. At first, it's exciting, but after a while, it becomes normal. You stop respecting it, because there's no uncertainty anymore, no tension, no possibility of loss. Now imagine the machine suddenly stops working. Suddenly, you care. Suddenly, you keep pulling the lever, trying harder, becoming frustrated, obsessed. Not because the machine changed, because access changed. That is human psychology. People rarely chase what feels guaranteed. They chase what they fear slipping away. And this is where most people completely misunderstand relationships. They think love keeps people. No. Emotional certainty keeps people comfortable. But uncertainty? That creates obsession. This is why people often come back only after you stop chasing. Not because they suddenly became emotionally mature overnight. Not because they magically realized your worth. But because for the first time, they are experiencing emotional instability. And the ego hates instability. The ego wants certainty, predictability, control. The moment that control disappears, panic begins. Not always externally, not dramatically, sometimes quietly, at night, alone. That's when they reread old conversations. That's when they check your profile. That's when they suddenly wonder who else has access to you now. Not because they fully lost you yet, because they're starting to realize they might. Most people think power means winning arguments, getting closure, making someone admit they were wrong. But real power? Real power is becoming emotionally unreachable. Not through games, not through manipulation, not through fake indifference, but through genuine detachment. And there's a difference. Because pretending not to care still means you care. Posting for attention still means you're emotionally attached. Trying to make them jealous still means your emotional world revolves around them. That is not freedom. That is dependency wearing a disguise. Real freedom is quieter. Real freedom is when you stop needing them to understand. Think about that carefully. Most people don't actually want closure. They want validation. They want the other person to finally say, "You were right. I was wrong. You mattered." But the truth is, waiting for emotional permission from someone who hurt you is still emotional captivity. And the moment you realize that, everything begins changing. Because now the goal is no longer making them regret losing you. The goal becomes outgrowing the version of yourself that needed their validation in the first place. That is the real transformation. And ironically, that is usually the moment they finally start feeling your absence. Because now your silence feels different, not manipulative, not performative, permanent. And people can feel the difference. There's a strange psychological shift that happens when someone realizes they no longer affect you emotionally. At first, they don't believe it. They think, they're just upset. They'll come back. They're trying to prove a point. But when days become weeks and weeks become months, and your energy never returns, that's when uncertainty becomes fear. Because now they can no longer read you, and human beings fear what they cannot read. Right now, part of you still wants to explain yourself. You want them to know how deeply they hurt you. You want them to understand why you walked away. You want one final conversation where everything finally makes sense. But listen carefully. Explanations create comfort. Even painful explanations create comfort. Because once people understand something, their mind can organize it, process it, move on from it. That's why unresolved endings stay alive longer than explained ones. Imagine a magician performing on stage. The audience is mesmerized. Every trick builds anticipation. Every movement creates curiosity. And then suddenly, without warning, he walks off stage. No finale, no explanation. The audience doesn't stop thinking about it, not because of what happened, because of what never happened. That's exactly what silence does. Most people expect drama, a final argument, a long emotional message. But when you simply leave, without explaining every wound, without begging to be understood, you force them to sit alone with their own thoughts. And trust me, people are often much harsher on themselves in silence than you ever would have been with words. Because now they start asking themselves questions. Did I push them too far? Were they secretly suffering the whole time? Did I completely lose them? And those questions echo, not for a day, not for a week, sometimes for years. Because unresolved emotions do not disappear, they linger. That's why some people still think about relationships from 10 years ago. Not because they were perfect, not because they were healthy, but because something about them never emotionally finished. The human brain craves resolution. And when resolution never comes, the mind keeps reopening the file, again and again and again. That's why becoming emotionally unavailable after always being emotionally present creates such a deep psychological shift. Because suddenly, certainty disappears, and people become addicted to trying to restore certainty. That's also why many people confuse guilt with love. They think, if they came back, it must mean I mattered. Not always. Sometimes people return because unresolved emotions bother the ego. Sometimes they return because they miss familiarity, because loneliness became uncomfortable, because losing emotional access damaged their sense of control. And this is important, because if you mistake temporary emotional discomfort for genuine transformation, you will reopen wounds that were finally beginning to heal. Most people think the power dynamic shifts when someone comes back. Wrong. The power dynamic shifts the moment you stop needing them to. That's the real turning point. Not the text message, not the apology, not the late night, "I miss you." Those things happen after. The real shift happens internally, quietly. It happens the moment you wake up one day and realize you didn't check your phone. The moment you stop wondering what they're doing. The moment you stop imagining conversations that will never happen. The moment your life slowly becomes yours again. That is the beginning of emotional freedom. And strangely enough, that's usually when they begin feeling your absence the most. Because now they can sense something terrifying. You are no longer emotionally orbiting them. And for someone who got used to your emotional availability, that feels like loss. Real loss. Not temporary distance, not emotional drama. Loss. That's when they start checking your page more often. That's when mutual friends suddenly hear about you. That's when your silence becomes louder than your words ever were. And this is where many people fail. Because the moment the other person reappears, they collapse emotionally. One message, one breadcrumb, one, hey, and suddenly they abandon all their growth. Why? Because they mistake attention for transformation. But attention is not change. Someone missing access to you does not automatically mean they value you correctly. Sometimes, people come back simply to test whether they still can. Can they still affect you emotionally? Can they still enter your life whenever they want? Can they still control your emotional state? That's why restraint matters, not to punish them, to protect your peace. Regret is rarely immediate. That's what most people don't understand. At first, people distract themselves. They go out, they post pictures. They convince themselves they made the right decision. And honestly, sometimes they even believe it. But distraction is temporary. Eventually, the noise fades. And when silence finally arrives, that's when memory becomes dangerous, because memory is emotional. People don't remember relationships logically, they remember emotionally. A song, a scent, a restaurant, a random Tuesday night, and suddenly you return to their mind. Not dramatically, quietly. That's how regret enters, slowly. At first, it's curiosity, then comparison, then realization. Because eventually, they discover something uncomfortable. Not everyone listens like you did. Not everyone understood them the way you did. Not everyone carried your energy. And by the time they truly feel the difference, you are no longer emotionally available to experience their realization. That is why patience matters. Not because you're waiting for them, because healing takes time, and so does regret. There's a huge difference between blocking someone and emotionally outgrowing them. Blocking someone can still be emotional, reactive, but becoming unreachable? That is evolution, because now your life no longer revolves around whether they understand your value. You stop performing your healing. You stop posting for emotional reactions. You stop trying to prove how happy you are. You simply become busy building a life that no longer depends on their recognition. And ironically, that's when your energy becomes magnetic. Because confidence that needs to be seen is insecurity. Real confidence moves quietly. Imagine a house you used to visit every day. For years, the door was always open. The lights were always on. You never questioned your access. Then one day, the lights are still on. You hear laughter inside. Life continues, but the door is locked. And no matter how long you stand outside, you cannot enter anymore. That feeling? That is emotional finality. And most people never experience it. Most people stay emotionally half-connected forever. Still checking, still hoping, still secretly waiting for signs. They call it love. But many times, it's fear. Fear of letting go, fear of starting over, fear of accepting that someone they emotionally built their future around no longer belongs in their life. And that fear keeps people emotionally trapped for years. That's why real healing begins the moment you stop asking, "How do I get them back?" and start asking, "Why was I willing to abandon myself just to keep someone who repeatedly hurt me?" That question changes everything, because now the focus shifts, away from them and back toward you. Not anger, not revenge, closure without explanation. And that is far more powerful than emotional chaos. At some point, this stops being about them entirely, and that is the moment your real life begins, because the deepest transformation happens when you stop trying to be chosen. For so long, your emotional world revolved around one question: how do I make them understand my value? But eventually, you reach a different realization. Your value was never dependent on their ability to recognize it. That changes everything. Now your growth becomes personal, not performative. You start building because you genuinely want peace. You start healing because you genuinely want freedom. You start evolving because you finally understand something important. You were never abandoned. You abandoned yourself trying to hold on to someone who stopped choosing you. And once you understand that, the desperation disappears. Now your silence no longer feels heavy. It feels peaceful. You stop checking, stop waiting, stop hoping. And slowly, without realizing it, you become someone entirely different. Not colder, stronger. Not emotionless, self-respecting. Not bitter, free. One day, they may come back. Maybe with curiosity. Maybe with regret. Maybe with nostalgia. Maybe because they finally understand what they lost. But by then, you won't need that anymore. And that is the true ending. Not revenge. Not making them suffer. Not watching them beg. Peace. Because the real victory was never forcing someone to value you. The real victory was finally valuing yourself enough to walk away from what repeatedly hurt you. That is what changes a person. Not heartbreak. Awareness. The awareness that love without respect destroys self-worth. The awareness that emotional availability without boundaries creates imbalance. The awareness that constantly proving yourself is emotional slavery. And once you truly understand that, you stop chasing closure. You become closure. Now say this quietly to yourself. I do not chase. I do not beg. I do not explain my worth. I move forward, without fear, without performance, without looking back. And the people who underestimated me, they can sit with the silence. Because by the time they finally understand what they lost, I will already be gone. Not physically, emotionally. And that is the moment everything changes. As Carl Jung once said, until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. And maybe that is what this entire journey was really about. Not them. You. Becoming aware of the parts of yourself that kept begging for validation from people who were never capable of giving you the love you deserved. Becoming aware of the fear that kept you emotionally attached. Becoming aware of the version of yourself that believed losing someone meant losing your worth. Because the moment you finally become conscious of that pattern, you stop chasing. And that is the moment everything changes. Because most people spend years trying to be understood by people who already decided not to understand them. They explain. They over-explain. They send paragraphs. They replay arguments. They beg for emotional clarity from people who benefit from keeping them emotionally confused. And slowly, without realizing it, they lose themselves. Not all at once, quietly, piece by piece. That is why silence becomes powerful. Not because silence magically hurts people, but because silence forces reality to finally breathe. No more emotional noise. No more chasing. No more trying to force connection where mutual effort no longer exists. And for someone who became emotionally comfortable having constant access to you, that silence becomes unsettling, because now they are alone with their own thoughts. And thoughts become dangerous when distractions disappear. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more videos like this.